Hello everyone, welcome to this new lecture on communication research. In this lecture we will talk about the progression of research from research problem to the sample or data. The objectives of this lecture are understanding difference between method and methodology, sampling and clarity in research. Let's recall this. There is a research problem we identify in the beginning, and then our aim is to find an answer to that problem. The answer we get is the thesis or dissertation. To achieve this aim, we must devise a suitable method. This method can be either experimental, inspired, or copied. But first, we need to understand the difference between method and methodology. Method is the technique or tool we use for collection of data and to derive a result. Methodology is the reason why we shall use a particular tool, and it's backed by the theories and concepts surrounding the issue under consideration. It is important to understand the difference between method and methodology because the subtle difference that exists between method and methodology has influence upon several other aspects of research. Let's consider some examples. Say we have to study the communication between two siblings, one of whom is 2 days old and the other one is 2 years old. First, before starting applying a method for doing it, we have to go into the whole concept of intrapersonal communication. Let's say there are two patterns that have been observed. Pattern 1 says when a 2-year-old becomes aware of the presence of his 2-day-old sibling, he becomes jealous. But he hides that jealousy by smiling a lot. As per the second pattern, the 2-year-old child becomes surprised and curious, which makes him to frequently pose questions to the infant sibling and their parents. In order to do our study on the communication between two siblings, we need to be aware of both these patterns, and we need to pick one of these two patterns that I just talked about in order to do our research. Once we do that, once we pick one of the two patterns, our tool for data collection will be dictated by the pattern we choose. If we choose pattern 1, our method will include counting the expressions on the face of the 2-year-old sibling. If we choose the second pattern, we will require to count and analyze the questions asked by the older sibling. Both these patterns are methodologies, and the mode of data collection subsequently decided upon by us is the method. Let's look at another example. Say our target is to find out the influence of newspapers upon their readers. As we will start learning about the researches conducted on this subject, we will come across several concepts or theories or patterns. Say one theory says the influence is judged by the number of times a reader would repeat the arguments made by a newspaper regarding a particular issue. And say a second theory says the influence is judged by the diversity of sources quoted by a newspaper in its reportage of one issue. Before we begin the study, we have to consider one of these two theories to base our research upon. One of these theories we will use to base our research upon, and then the method we might choose will be accordingly dictated to us. These two theories therefore form our methodology, and the tool we shall use to collect the data will be known as the method. It shall have already become clear to you by now that methodology is something we pay attention to very early on in the research, since it has to do with the theories, with the concepts, with the patterns upon which we base our research. So we have to pay attention to methodology, to the whole idea of methodology very early on in our research. What exactly does it change once we pay attention to the methodology? What exactly does knowing about the methodology change in our research? It makes our review of literature very pointed. Once we start favoring a methodology, we target only the previous researches that are based on the same methodology. Means we now have a clear idea of what type of researches we are trying to find, and our review of literature will become very sharp and pointed. By keeping the idea of methodology in mind, we have very less possibility of doing an irrelevant research, because methodology will always keep us focused, and we will always have to think. We can never think of an idea which is isolated. We have talked about this in our previous lectures. Methodology makes it very easy for us to frame a research problem, because with methodologies a researcher has a clear idea of what he is looking for and why is he looking for that. Then methodology finally dictates our method and saves us a lot of effort. So these are the benefits of paying attention to methodology very early on in our research process. Now, after choosing a methodology to work with, we will achieve one of these two results. Either we will be giving a new theory, or we will be testing an existing theory. If we are giving a new theory, at the end of the research, the result of our research is that we are coming up with a new theory, it will be called inductive research. If we are testing an existing theory, it will be called as deductive research. The method a researcher follows can be experimental, it can be inspired, or it can be copied. Now, experimental method means a researcher can experiment with a new method with a sound justification acquired from the existing works. It cannot be out of the blue that you come up with a method. It has to have a sound justification which comes from the researches which have been conducted before you. Then you can use a method which is inspired, means the method used can be an improvisation upon an existing method. And then it can be a copied method, means the method is exactly as given by someone else. In this case, and in case of the inspired methods, you will have to give due credit. We'll talk more about it when we come to the ethical part of research. At this point, let's try to understand what is meant by hypothesis and how to use it. Hypothesis is a statement made by a researcher at the start of his research. The idea then is to prove this hypothesis right or wrong with the help of your research. But hypothesis is not just any wild guess. It's based on the existing knowledge. It's a guess. It is a guess, but not a wild guess. It's a guess, or it's rather an estimation made on the basis of existing knowledge or the concepts. For instance, if there is a war in some country and we are trying to study how the media covered this war, we can start with a hypothesis, and a possible hypothesis can be that war made the media biased or follow the popular us versus them pattern of reportage. When then the research is conducted, our aim is to prove whether this hypothesis is right or whether it is wrong. That will be the outcome of our research. Now let's focus on sampling. Before we do that, I would like to talk a bit about the necessity of clarity in research. The need for clear definitions in research. In research, there needs to be clarity and precision. It will not be wrong to say that a researcher needs to redefine sometimes even the simplest things to suit his study and to cut out the possibilities of ambiguity. The definitions can sometimes be borrowed from predecessors or they can be created afresh. Take the term human rights violations, for instance. While doing a research on media and conflict, we need to follow a clear definition of what comprises human rights violations. We cannot rely upon presumptions and generalizations. Human rights violations, for example, include a range of things from extrajudicial killings to torture, to denial of fair trial, to restrictions on freedom of expression, and so on. A researcher working on the subject needs to be clear about which aspects of human rights violations he needs to study. Without doing so, it will be difficult to explain why some aspects were followed and why some aspects were left out, or it will become very difficult for a researcher to study all the aspects. Once we do the content analysis, we need to be very certain about what we are looking for. So a clear definition is required. What do we mean by human rights violations, and what is included in this? What aspects we are going to take up, and what are the aspects we are going to leave? For example, if we are doing this research, it will be difficult to explain why, for example, killings were covered in the research, in the study, while, for example, choking of the public space or choking of the public voices was not. In this example about human rights violations, the researcher can take up a standard definition and subsequently take up only selected aspects with proper justification. A study involving, in a similar way, a study involving terrorism can be another example. The first task for any study on terrorism would be to define the term terrorism and then make that term the prism through which all the data will have to pass through. No study on terrorism shall start with a presumption that terrorism is a term which is self-explanatory, even if that may actually be the case. These research-specific definitions or redefinitions can be sometimes referred to as operational definitions. This is just another way of illustrating the significance of research. Research is deconstruction and reconstruction of knowledge and ideas. We deconstruct the ideas at first and then we reconstruct them with the help of our research. Either we construct them either in the same form with more proof or in the corrected form. There are some technical terms though that every researcher needs to know. Let's once again recall what we do in the process of a research. We start with a question and spend time finding an answer to that question. But how do we find that answer? We follow a formula which is called method, and with that formula we process the data within which lies our answer. Let's once again take up an example to understand this in a better way. Let's say we are trying to study the coverage given by the Indian media to the spread of novel coronavirus in the country. The problem at hand here is studying the Indian media from, say, the start of the outbreak till the end of the lockdown, which is like a period of 2 months minimum. When we say we have to study Indian media, it actually includes all the newspapers, magazines, portals, television channels, and much more. Try to have an idea how much sources and how much data this means. The newspapers alone in India are in thousands. That's why we need to be precise with using terms in a research process. Saying media without having an idea what it includes will be impractical, because we will not be able to process this much of data. We need to be very precise by using clear terms such as newspapers. We'll be studying Indian newspapers coverage of novel coronavirus, or studying, instead of using Indian media, using clear terms like television channels or new media. This reduces the amount of data we will have to process. Now let's say we become precise and declare that we want to find out the coverage given by the newspapers to the coronavirus pandemic. We are leaving out, once we do that, once we use term newspapers instead of media, we are leaving out all media except newspapers, which is a big relief. But again, like I said earlier, the newspapers in India are in thousands and in various languages. So the need is to be more precise by saying English newspapers or Telugu newspapers or Urdu newspapers or Hindi newspapers. Or we can use some other way of classifying the newspapers. Let's become more precise again and say that we want to find out the coverage given to the coronavirus spread by the English newspapers in India. There are many ways of reaching this precision, but all the ways require a sound justification. It cannot be done merely on the whims and wishes of a researcher. There is a process for reaching this precise stage. Now, each newspaper on an average has 12 to 16 pages of news content. If we start doing content analysis of the English newspapers, one single paper will take us a minimum of 1 day, 24 hours. Now imagine how much time is it going to take us to study all the thousands of English newspapers and their coverage over a period of 2 months. Well, practically speaking, it is not difficult because it is impossible. It cannot be done. Therefore, we rely on a process that allows us to choose only some among thousands of newspapers and yet derive a conclusion that can be generalized for all the newspapers. This is to say, we study a subset of the set of English newspapers in India and come up with a conclusion that applies to the whole set, as if we have studied all the English newspapers. This process of choosing a subset within a set is called sampling. The set in this case, in our example, is all the English newspapers in India. The whole set will be called population or universe. Population can be classified into two categories, finite and infinite. The population is said to be finite if it consists of a fixed number of elements so that it is possible to enumerate it in its totality. Examples of finite population are the populations of a city, the number of workers in a factory, etc. The number of English papers, for example. An infinite population is one in which it is theoretically impossible to observe all the elements. In an infinite population, the number of items is infinite. Examples of infinite population can be the number of stars in the sky. But for practical considerations, we use the term infinite population for a population that cannot be enumerated in a reasonable period of time. For example, if we are talking about the readers or audience of a news channel, though they are finite because we know how many people live in a city and how many people are actually watching this channel, but it is practically not possible to deal with them. So even this population will be called infinite population. And the subset we choose from this population is called sample. And this sample has to be representative of the population. The process of sampling, therefore, is the process of choosing a representative sample from within the population. If Indian media is our population, the sample can be taken from news channels. If newspapers are our population, English newspapers can provide us the sample. If English newspapers are the population, the Hindu and Hindustan Times can be our sample. Population is how a researcher identifies it, and sample is what is practically possible to study. Once you understand the whole idea of sampling, it becomes very easy to bring in precision into the work. And you also understand why being certain with terms is important and how the population and the sample are to be approached. The advantages of doing sampling are it makes research possible. If we don't have sampling, we won't be able to deal with the entire population, which means research will not be practically possible. It's the process of sampling alone that makes research possible. That sampling saves time. Let's say it is possible to deal with the entire population, to process entire population as data, but then it will take a huge amount of time, even if it becomes possible. When we do sampling, we get the same conclusion that we would get by dealing with the entire population in a very less amount of time. Then it saves resources. If you have to deal with the population of the entire city, it will take a lot of resources, reaching out to them, talking to them, collecting the data, processing the data. But when we are dealing with a sample, we are dealing with a smaller number from among the population. So it saves us a lot of resources. Then it brings in accuracy. When we do sampling and we apply the statistical tools, it is very possible for us to accurately judge the results that we are trying to achieve. There are other terms related to sampling. Let's look at them. First is sampling unit. In a study on media, A newspaper can be a sampling unit. In a study on newspapers, a news story or an editorial can be a sampling unit. Sampling unit basically are the basic units or groups which can be conveniently included in a sample. A sampling unit needs to be clearly defined, identifiable, observable, and convenient for sampling. For instance, in a family budget inquiry, usually a family is considered as the sampling unit since it's found to be convenient for sampling and for ascertaining the required information. Say the way of explaining this would be that if we are studying something, if we are studying the economic base or something else concerning a city, uh, our sampling unit can be the family. In another study, we can have an individual as a sampling unit because an individual is identifiable, observable, is can be picked up for sample or for sampling. Say in a crop survey, if we are studying crops, a field of crops can be the sampling unit, and our population will comprise of these sampling units from which we will pick up different sampling units and they will become our sample. Then the second term is sampling frame. Any list containing all sampling units is known as sampling frame. Say we are studying a newspaper's online reach, and our method of going about it is looking at its Facebook followers. The friend list of this newspaper's Facebook page will be our sampling frame. Say we are dealing with people in a city and we are trying to do a study on telemarketing. We can take up the directory on which we have all the names and numbers of the people, and then that can become our sampling frame in a study which is involving telemarketing. Sampling frame consists of a list of items from which